Hello, I'm Mark Helfand. I'm going to talk today about the evidence-based synthesis program in the Veterans Health System. I was asked to speak about how our embedded evidence shop, which is abbreviated the ESP, works within the VA health system. Few learning health systems have access to an in-house systematic review shop, and even fewer rely on that shop for operational input. Although learning health systems and evidence synthesis programs both talk about evidence-based medicine, linking learning health systems with evidence synthesis has not been easy. Learning from real-time data and pursuing continuous improvement isn't necessarily a good match with how systematic reviewers have come to think and work. Systematic reviewers don't do real time, and they tend to focus on what's already known, not on what can be done. In fact, it sometimes feels like systematic reviewers are trained not to say anything that might actually be useful. The very language they use can be a barrier to effective communication. The phrases that I gave the centaur in this figure are common sources of frustration in the health system community. Insufficient for what? Why just randomized trials? Why just publish data? Why ignore observational studies? So to some, it feels like systematic reviewers have something useful to say, but you have to drag it out of them. And I've experienced this firsthand with a wide variety of researchers, not just systematic reviewers. When their work might actually be used by someone for important decisions, they worry about all the limitations and caveats, and it almost feels like they don't want anyone to use it except other researchers. So the instinctive response to a mismatch like this is to try to understand the customer's needs. And in fact, what learning health systems have been asking for is not too hard to understand. They've been pretty clear about it for a while. This is this reference that just appeared is one where our commissioned a report to interview people in learning health systems and ask them about what they're looking for in from evidence products. The health system people said to clarify how the evidence applies to local and operational context, develop mechanisms to integrate internal data with published evidence, and do timely reviews. This is not the complete list, but it's what would fit on a slide. So the what isn't too difficult. The how has been more difficult. So today I'll start with a little background about the ESP, and then talk about the principles we applied in building the ESP program into an integral part of the learning cycle in the VA health system. I'll touch on how we present evidence to system leadership, but mostly I want to talk about how we adapted our methods to the needs of decision makers within a learning health system. And I just would say that that article that's cited at the bottom, it has 19 authors, but I highlighted that 6 of those, which is pretty good, are from Portland. They're not all from the ESP, but they're all connected in one way or another with our shop at some point in the past. So the background about the ESP program, it was piloted in 2005 and then established in 2007. And its initial mission was to provide tailored, timely, and accurate evidence synthesis of VA-relevant, veteran-focused healthcare topics. And the reports were meant to help with developing clinical policies, implementing effective services, and supporting VA guideline practice and performance measures, and set the direction for future research to address gaps in clinical knowledge. there are currently 3 ESP centers across the United States. There used to be 4. And the directors of those, I'll talk about them a little bit more later, but they started out having close ties to the ARC Evidence-Based Practice Center program. Those programs are in Los Angeles, Minneapolis, and Durham, North Carolina. There's 2 more components to the program. Essentially central office and in Washington, D.C., and the coordinating center in Portland, Oregon, which is what I lead. So at our end, in developing those 2, I should just talk a bit about those 2 elements. The steering committee is also an element in Washington, and it's comprised of health system leadership and researchers who provide program direction. And the main function of the steering committee over the years was to keep us in touch. It had representatives from the field, representatives from the VISNs, which are the regional health systems in the VA. It gave us a mechanism to be in touch so that people didn't forget about us. The Coordinating Center manages program operations to ensure methodologic consistency and the quality of the products, to interface with stakeholders, evaluate nominated topics, and work with VA leaders to prioritize them. That's VA or Office of Research Development. And to produce rapid products to inform more urgent policy and program decisions. Another thing, our job is to stay out of the way of the 3 centers. We stay out of their way to encourage experimentation and innovation. And we can do this really because of the people involved. And I can't overemphasize that the ESP had really a unique advantage in making this embedded process for evidence work. First, the people. On our end, the ESP was founded by VA physicians who were also and already internationally recognized investigators in the field of evidence-based medicine. They didn't have to look over their shoulder and worry about whether they were doing research synthesis correctly. The pilot investigators were Paul Schickel of Southern California and myself. And later, when we became a full-fledged program, we added Tim Wilt at the Minneapolis VA and John Williams at the Durham VA in North Carolina. And in addition to their accomplishments in research synthesis, all of these people had made a mark in other types of research, not just systematic review, and all had worked with clinical practice guideline groups and had been involved in high-profile clinical controversies. None of us were looking for a fight, but we weren't afraid of them either, and all of us were used to having our work be used by policymakers. I'd just add that at the Coordinating Center, Nicole Floyd, the deputy director, and I guess I would say operations manager, she had worked as a quality improvement coordinator for CARE Oregon and as an interim project director at Ocean, which you may have heard about, and later worked at the Oregon EPC before coming to the VA to build the ESP program. So she also was accustomed to working on high-profile projects under intense political scrutiny and was comfortable with high-stakes work with multiple stakeholders. Our partners, too, were extraordinary. By the time the program was launched, we had come to know health system leaders who welcomed and contributed to our mission. So early partners were the National Leadership of Nursing Services and the Office of the Deputy Undersecretary for Health Quality and Safety, as well as the leader of Specialty Care Services. Joe Francis, who was at that time leading the Query program, spearheaded the ESP pilot from the leadership side. And I don't know if you know Joe, but he has a gift for figuring out ways to use evidence in decision-making. Sort of the established use of it at the time of these systematic reviews was in guideline development, and the VA was engaged in that. But it took I think, sort of very special partnership devoted to figuring out ways to use it for other processes in decisions. So there were many more. I don't mean to leave anybody out of the list here, but these were key elements that we got started with. And another thing another thing we'll get to is the principles that we started with. This is really a handout more than anything else. But I thought that for this audience, we should at least describe a little bit, or just a list, projects we've had in the rehabilitation area. And this started in quite early in the program. This is in reverse order, really. Pain in patients with polytrauma. The very last review on the list was actually done, I think, in 2007 or 8, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later. But we've been working with rehabilitation related offices within VA at the bottom, and the fine print at the bottom has the acronyms and names of those offices. And so this is a rather impressive list, I think, demonstrating the commitment of the rehab groups in the VA to using evidence in their decision processes. So regarding those principles that I mentioned, in ESP, we applied principles that I'd learned from working on other evidence synthesis programs, really between 98 and 2007 when this program began. Some of those principles we wrote about in a series we did for AHRQ when it started its comparative effectiveness program. And so I didn't quote it here, but there is an article that describes some of these. Independence. I used the term separate identities, and that is to say that while we are partnering with the people who are asking for the evidence review or using it, we maintain separate identities. They often want a particular answer, and they know from experience that we will be independent and not just give them the answer that they want. So if we get a request for a review that says, can you review the evidence so that we can make the case for so-and-so, we know it works, but apparently we're having trouble convincing others. They know that they're not going to get something that just sort of takes sides like that, and that will be guided by the literature. I mean, this seems obvious that this would be important in systematic review, but trustworthiness comes up as uniformly in every survey of key informants in health systems, and we'd lose trustworthiness if we didn't maintain our independence. Responsiveness to user needs. Inclusiveness with respect to what evidence fits, and I'll talk about these two items more later. We think the work should matter to somebody who can do something with it. Leaders will, not get ahead of the curve by looking around at what is out there now and trying to implement it. High reliability organization concepts have been around for a while. Now there's a rush for health system leaders everywhere to implement it. And if that's how the system always operates, to wait for things that are out there for a while that innovators and pioneers have developed and implemented, and then try to catch up, they'll never catch up. So we've looked to work with health system partners who are thinking 5 years ahead, rather than those who are always trying to catch up, because the people who are looking ahead are more open to innovation. That last item, encourage innovation and challenge tradition, is the most important one. And when I talk about tradition there, I mean what's considered tradition in systematic reviews. In medicine, the field of evidence synthesis, also called research synthesis, began as part of a movement, and it was exciting to be there at the beginning, which I would say, you could argue about when the beginning was, but I would go back probably to the 1980s. But somehow it became narrow-minded and in some respects even reactionary as far as the methods that they use and the way that they present information. And this made it difficult to innovate. So to illustrate this point, and at the same time emphasize the continuity of our vision over the years, I want to go back in time and talk about some of the experiences we had before we started ESP that led to these principles and that also led to our approach to innovation and to responsiveness. So the ESP concept built on lessons we learned in the ARC Evidence-Based Practice Center program, which began in 1998. And the first lesson you're very familiar with, and that is tackle important problems. I used to direct an evidence-based practice center, the one in Oregon, and we sought to work in settings where there were identifiable active decision makers who needed us. So for 6 or 7 years, we worked with the newly revived U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, which had been closed down and then reopened in the late 90s once the EPC program was developed. And we found developed ways with the task force members to prioritize topics for evidence reviews, to tailor the methods of synthesis to the needs of the task force guidelines panel. This means that the form, the content, the emphasis, the analyses of our reports were shaped by the needs of and reactions of the task force members. And several task force members were themselves leaders in the field of research synthesis. And this made it easy because to innovate because of their historical and methodologic sense of what is and isn't acceptable, whether you can be adherent to the principles of systematic review and still change things. So woven through this history lesson I'm about to give is the concept that a lot of what's considered traditional in systematic review is really just a set of practices or habits that were well adapted to the use of reviews for some particular purpose, in the task force case for developing practice guidelines. But those practices and habits can be a hindrance in systematic review for any other purpose. And I don't really know what's traditional about them in the sense that we had developed them, they just got old and then suddenly became kind of the canon. That's not how it ever should have worked. So around 2002, after working with the task force, we saw another opportunity, a collaboration of state Medicaid pharmacy directors, which was later called the Drug Effectiveness Review Project. And for this audience, we changed how reports were organized. For instance, we elevated head-to-head trials at to the top of the evidence hierarchy, or at least to the top of to the beginning of the results section. And a workshop that I did with Steve Wolf and Russ Harris at Academy Health in 2002, which was meant to lay out some fundamentals of systematic review. Really looking back at the slides from 2002, it really does illustrate the continuity of this thinking that informed the ESP 5 or 6 years later. This is a slide from 2002. Systematic reviews are systematic to remove bias in finding and reviewing the literature. They emphasize the best evidence, and they're synthetic to make insights that cannot be learned from the individual studies alone. Back then, by the way, when we talked about, this is another slide from there, what the best evidence was, we said it addresses health outcomes, not just intermediate outcomes. It considers the potential harms as well as benefits of the interventions. It applies, meaning it's applicable to the in real life, if you will, and it fits the circumstances. And this description of best evidences, of the best evidence, is not necessarily what you would read in any current textbook of systematic review. Back then, and especially in the work with the task force, we didn't have a lot of hangups about observational studies. In fact, the task force recommended screening for cervical cancer on the basis of observational studies. And even in the work with the drug effectiveness stuff, we really came across phenomena and experiences that brought out how valuable observational studies can be. Let me give you two examples. Well, I'll give you one example looking at the time. So, there were a number of studies of interferon for treating hepatitis C, and they had their rates of response and so on. But the patients, as you'd expect in pre-marketing studies, were highly selected. So in Olmsted County at Mayo, they did a population-based study of all the patients they had given these drugs to look at the rates of response in real life. And that discrepancy between what you read in the literature as far as 70% response rate versus what happens in real life, the number of patients that discontinue, the number of patients that actually don't survive for other reasons, for whatever reason, looking at whether the literature applies in actual practice seemed to me, still seems like an essential part of presenting a systematic review. If you don't know that it's applicable to real circumstances, nothing in it, including whatever comparison it's making of treatment outcomes or implementation outcomes, really isn't valid without some validation in real life data. So the other story I wanted to tell about those days, I'm not sure it fits the question here, but it seemed like a good story. So, we looked at triptans, a comparative effectiveness review of all the triptans. And there was something like 45 randomized trials, and all of them used different doses of whatever triptans they were studying. These are head-to-head trials comparing one or more triptans. And we had a citizen panel essentially to help us develop what questions we were going to address in the review. And one of the participants, a Medicaid patient, he said, what I really want you to ask is, how far does half a pill go? I mean, on Medicaid, I get 4 a month at most, sometimes 3 a month. And so what I want to know is how small can I cut them up and still get pretty good relief? And, the standard doses of these drugs are usually selected based on a curve that goes sort of like, low dose is about this effective, a little higher is this effective, then it starts to flatten out. And they usually pick the one here where the flat of the curve begins. But, these lower doses are effective for a certain number of people. So we scoured all that literature and anything else we could find to see what doses below the recommended or the pill size, how effective they could be. We also found a study, an observational study in a workplace setting that was only about sumatriptan. And what it said essentially was that once sumatriptan came on the market, migraineurs had fewer work days lost. So there was no comparison. But we had no other study, none of those head-to-head studies that looked at anything that tangible as whether people were having to miss work or not. Of course, it doesn't tell you about the quality of the work. People can space out and have a hard time once they get to work if they're not feeling great. But we thought it was very important. We thought that looking at an outcome that the other drugs haven't looked at, or the makers of the other drugs haven't looked at, should give a drug an advantage because you knew it did something and you don't know how well the rest of them do it. So it's not much of a stretch from these kind of considerations to think of looking at health system data to see whether estimates from the published literature are even applicable in a local setting. A couple more illustrations of our inclusive view of evidence. These are things that most people don't really consider when they're looking at the quality, the reliability or validity of observational studies. And I'll try to be, well, these are pretty technical, but let me just start with the data environment for a study, because that's something I think everybody here can understand pretty well. We were looking at a device called Infuse, which is used in spinal fusion surgery as an alternative to a regular traditional bone graft. And we had dozens of studies that were done mostly at single institutions, mostly by a single surgeon or a group of surgeons, that were looking at adverse events from the traditional versus the Infuse approach to the surgery. And most of these studies had serious flaws, as you'd expect. They were retrospective, they had historical controls. Even if they had concurrent controls, the patients who were selected to have traditional surgery instead of Infuse probably were very different in their characteristics and prognosis. So really not a very impressive literature. And that is something I'm sure you all have heard a lot about, these kind of small observational studies of adverse events. But we noticed that a couple of these studies came from what we would call an enriched data environment, from a learning health system is probably what we'd call it today. This was done a while ago. And that is to say, if the same study with almost the same methods are being done in two different environments, hospitals, let's say, and one of those hospitals has put a lot of thought, energy, and effort into measurement, into audit, into seeing the quality of their data, into relying on those data to make decisions using statistical process control methods and P-charts and things like this. Then as they observed changing from the traditional surgery to Infuse, if they observed an increase in some adverse event that they were measuring, it probably means something. And even taking it a step further, it probably means something if it meets the criteria that they might use in a statistical process control setting. Whereas a similar study by a devoted surgeon who really wants to get the answers but doesn't have those resources, the institution doesn't really have hasn't made the effort to look at reliability of data, to monitor it, to look at these trends over time, that study has much lower reliability. Well, this idea of the data environment, of having a study from a learning health system get a higher rating, if you will, for validity than a similar study from a different system, it doesn't have there's no place for that in how systematic reviewers have rated the quality of the evidence. Another thing we considered is the concordance with other information to strengthen observational studies. I think because of time, I probably can't go further into that example. If we have time, I'll talk about it later. But essentially looking at modeling studies or talking to people at the outliers that use or don't use or use an intervention effectively or had trouble implementing it, would be concordance with what the quantitative literature shows. The parameters point is kind of wonky, but in a decision science setting makes a lot of sense. So if you have a complicated decision, and I'm thinking here of decision analysis, when you do some analysis of that, it may turn out that what you really want to know is something that isn't an effect size. It isn't a comparison question of A versus B. It's what I would call a parameter. So to give you an example, if you're trying to figure out whether a strategy of early surgery versus waiting for cataracts is better, you could do a randomized trial of early versus late intervention for mild opacities. Or you can analyze the question a little further, and you might notice that what really matters is how often somebody with an early opacity progresses to the point where they give up activities, let's say driving, golf, whatever, that they enjoyed and aren't able to recover that even after cataract surgery corrects the refractive errors. I mean, the visual acuity. And so that's a parameter. You don't need a randomized trial. What you need is good observation and practice to see that if you had that policy of waiting, what proportion of people have progression of the opacity and over what time. And that can help you develop a clinical policy. And I'd say quicker and in a very different way than just doing a randomized trial of everything. So sometimes we look at a clinical question that's presented to us as one of comparative effectiveness or needing a randomized trial, and we come up with, no, what you really need is to measure this parameter. So let's go back and talk about how this applies in the ESP in the VA system. And a good starting point, and this is something you've all familiar with, I think, is this paper. I think Charles Friedman talked with you about this this picture. And you know, the kind of the well-known sentence for us in the systematic review world from this work, Mind the Gap, is that the LHS, the Learning Health System, combines internal data with external evidence in this brown box to produce knowledge that's put in practice. And so the concept was, and it's spelled out very well in the paper, you know, the concept was that you can't rely only on your internal data and your processes for collecting, developing, answering questions. You do need some use of external evidence, and didn't really specify exactly what that evidence is useful for or how to use it. But in a sense, it was a breakthrough because it said, here's a direction we can go where we will work with research synthesis experts, use systematic review in some sense in our processes. And I say it's a breakthrough because, as I said earlier, it really has been difficult to bring these two ideas together and to figure out where it fits in to use these reviews. So the other point here is this green arrow, which essentially says to bring health system data results into the critical appraisal, which maybe no longer should be called external evidence if you call that, but just evidence. But what if we take this concept a little further? I think if you take this further, you get an idea of what we tried to do in the ESP, although I'd say maybe we weren't conscious of it, but it's kind of what happened. Knowledge to performance, that phase of the cycle, you know, that talks about how best practice knowledge is rapidly made available to support decisions. And in performance to data, it's kind of self-explanatory, and data to knowledge, you know, are capturing characteristic events and context as data so you can learn from it and then and improve performance. So what if we looked at ways that we could review evidence or at least create some kind of evidence product that informed all of these steps too? I don't mean comprehensively every single step in the process, but some other steps besides this one. And on a similar note, let me just remind you of some other kind of similar kind of thinking. You know, RE-AIM, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, describes factors that influence implementation success. So it would stand to reason that if we're asked to do a systematic review to help people implement something in a health system, we might look to re-aim or to some other way of describing factors and organize the evidence product around that idea. So that if we know the nominator is interested in determinants or certain determinants, it wouldn't be hard to dive into the report. You wouldn't have to dive into the report and read all over the place to say, where do they talk about these? It would actually be the organizing principle of the results or of a major section of the results. Since determinants are used in designing interventions and picking strategies and even in figuring out what metrics to use, it would seem like it seems kind of obvious that the standard way that a systematic review is organized won't fit that purpose very well. So for implementation questions, we look for ways of using evidence in other parts of this cycle. Let me just find that slide here. So for knowledge to performance, performance to data, and data to knowledge, what does that really come down to for a systematic review? Well, it comes down to that the review topic can be what to measure instead of, what works best in theory. So if you have a review that says, we looked at the different alternatives, we can't find important differences, or evidence isn't sufficient to say which is best, that really doesn't have to be the point of the review. The point of the review could be, if you implement this, here's what might be worth measuring, or here's what hasn't been measured that could inform whether it improves the quality of care or the outcomes that you're looking for. And similarly, sometimes we talk to, if you will, clients that need evidence so that they can build a business case for something, let's say for a program to reduce diagnostic errors in the emergency room. We would think of that as looking at the structure of the business case and organizing the report to inform that structure so that they could use it easily for that purpose. And I'll get to an example of where the goal was to implement a service system-wide and the kind of product we came up with for that. So all of this led us to really be diversify, and I'd say in some sense be quite innovative with the products we developed over the years. We started, as I said, around 2007. In 2008, we did a review of pain in patients with polytrauma. And the idea of this review, I think it was an important review for us conceptually. The first key question that this review addressed was, how have reliable and valid measures and assessment tools been developed to measure pain intensity and pain-related functional interference among patients with cognitive deficits due to traumatic brain injury? Which measures and tools are likely to be most useful in assessing pain in polytrauma patients with cognitive deficits? This was definitely not an idle sort of curiosity-driven question. This was a question that was really critical. The VA had set up polytrauma units around the country, clinical polytrauma units, and they had set up some measurements that they were making, questionnaires and other measures on all the patients. And the question came up in Congress as well as in the VA. Are you going to have something for us in 4 or 5 years? What are you going to learn from all this clinical care and all this measurement and tracking you're doing? And so in a very real sense, the underlying question from the one I read you is, are we measuring the right things? Are we measuring them well enough so that we'll have improvements in the care of polytrauma patients whose pain or pain control is maybe interfering with their rehabilitation progress? That's it speaks for itself. It's 14 years ago. but it really does show the use of systematic review in parts of that cycle, essentially what to measure and how to measure it, that aren't necessarily what people think of first when they think of what systematic reviews are used for. Another example that I wanted to highlight are evidence maps. We were approached by people in the VA who wanted to implement essentially a broader scope of practice, meaning that the VA was now going to offer acupuncture and some other modalities that it hadn't offered. And every single VA facility is going to have to figure out how much of this to offer and who to offer it to, so that they could either hire people or contract with people in the community to deliver those services. So that turned into our first evidence map. The little circles are different indications for acupuncture. And from left to right, essentially, or from evidence of no effect carpal tunnel all the way to evidence of a positive effect, was meant to give you some idea of the size of the literature and our confidence in the results. And mostly this was done by looking at other systematic reviews and kind of capturing what they said and supplementing that by studies that had been done since those other reviews were published. This was used throughout the VA to develop some additional materials that would help the units in the health system regionally and in individual facilities figure out or estimate, how much of these services they should buy based on, the indications that they wanted to cover and the prevalence or frequency of those problems in their population. I think it was quite a success. And we ended up doing something like 8 more evidence maps for different services for the group that had originally asked for the acupuncture work. Remember, nobody asks for, oh, I want an evidence map if they haven't seen one before. Nobody had seen one before we did this. It's our job to listen and to figure out what sort of presentation or product would help them. And I think people often mistake being customer focused with putting too much on the customer to figure out what the product should be. We have to have in the ESP, we've always thought we need to have some creativity, but also and flexibility, but also the skill of figuring out what product we could develop that would help meet particular needs from our customers, if you will. Some more of the diversification of the product line. Sometimes we have had an analysis of VA health system data alongside one of our reviews. I just give you one example of that here about robot-assisted procedures in general surgery. This report, through analysis of administrative and registry data, augments findings from the 2020 systematic review of the published literature on robot-assisted procedures in general surgery compared to other approaches. It makes perfect sense to me, and it always has since that example from Mayo on hepatitis, that a systematic review is incomplete unless it also has data that says whether, let's say, the complication rates in the literature for these different procedures are anything like the ones in our system. If the complication rates that original report and the systematic review found were, let's say, 4% versus 2% for robotic versus conventional laparoscopic cholecystectomy, and ours in the VA were 1% overall or 7%, we have a different problem. And that comparison that was made in that report might not apply to us. So this seems sometimes that it's essential, not just an idea, to look at health system data to complement what's in the report. I guess, there isn't time to look at every innovation, but one that is kind of current is our work on living reviews, and particularly in the context of COVID-19 decision support. This was an interesting stress test for us in 2020. We were asked by people in the VA leadership what we could do to contribute to the COVID-19 data mess, information overload, all of that. And I think it showed some kind of nimbleness and resiliency that we were able to work with them and be helpful. Don't have time to go all into it, but we were able to produce some reviews within 7 to 10 days. We did all these other things, and we set up the website covid19reviews.org to avoid duplication of effort on our part. That is, we wanted to know if there was already a valid systematic review of something before we went through the time and expense of doing one ourselves. And that turned into a resource that other systematic reviewers around the country could look at, around the world could look at and decide if their work was going to be duplicative or complementary. So, so let's go back to our figure. And I guess the point of this talk really, along the way, we've developed different named reports, systematic review, evidence brief, memo. We probably have 15 products. We didn't set out to say we're going to have a product line with 15 items. We tried to solve particular nominations or customers' needs and developed a product that was suitable and then gave it a name later. And some of these, were helpful. That is, people could identify now what an evidence map was and see if they wanted one. Some of them didn't go anywhere, but we never were stuck with our product line as 2 or 3 things, find a way to use those. We also essentially put these different projects, I didn't talk about all of these, but in different parts of this. That is, we did succeed, I think, in informing different areas of the cycle, not just sort of into the data to knowledge cycle. And the COVID work, we're trying now to see if we can work with the COVID investigators across VA so that their results are brought into our reviews in a fast and direct manner, rather than having to wait for them to be published in the literature and to lose the ones that aren't. I wanted to mention the advanced practice nurse scope of practice review we did very quickly. The VA faced some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure, a great deal of pressure to expand the scope of practice for advanced practice nurses uniformly across the country, because different states have different regulations, but the VA technically can override those regulations and expand the scope of practice of nurse practitioners as it sees fit. There were contradictions that you're probably all familiar with, but somebody practicing, let's say in White River Junction, would have patients in New Hampshire that they couldn't prescribe for and patients in Vermont that they could. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense for the VA. Advocates for all sides of this were pushing that the literature convincingly showed that backed up their position. Institute of Medicine and other organizations, Robert Wood Johnson, had chimed in on this. We looked at that literature, randomized trials. We thought they were out of date. We thought that they were interesting trials, but they were done before the team concepts of primary care and other concepts had come in. So we didn't think they were very applicable today. And what we told the VA was, base your implementation on other grounds, access to care and consistency of care and so on. And then use the quality data on primary care that you already collect nationally in a very big, well-established process to see what the impact is, and don't rely on these old randomized trials to figure out what you're going to do going forward. And one more that I wanted to mention before we're done is what the VA's called the Shark Tank, where health systems leaders come and they propose ideas that they, or actually people propose innovations that they want the health system leaders to adopt in their regions. They pitch it. Other people decide whether to go with it or not in their own system. There's some go and some don't for each one of these. And they asked us to look at the Shark Tank proposals and just do a very quick take to try to weed out those that had already been proven useless, so that you really shouldn't have them in the mix. And also those where there wasn't clearly an alternative that was well established. And one thing I want to say about evidence in health systems is that it isn't a matter of, this works, do it. It's often a matter of, we really can't tell you that these things are any better than one another, so have at it. It gives you freedom, really, to innovate or to experiment when you know that different implementation strategies or different concepts over the years have not panned out as well as we'd hoped, or don't have consistent results, or hit a wall and now it's on the flat of the curve. There's a sort of more traditional view that, it tells you systematic reviews are what works, and if it doesn't work, you're done. But actually, our customers are often happier to hear that there's not something there that they have to do, so that they can design their interventions and use this kind of cycle rather than some kind of given published literature to decide how to fix it and come up with an improved product. One of the things that we, I guess the last thing I wanted to mention is, what's our core expertise? I mean, essentially, it's to look at a problem with fresh eyes and with a broad background in clinical epidemiology and decision science, and really help flush out the policy space or the decision space. We know that health system leaders don't want to be the first out of the gate to try something new if it could be harmful or cause waste. But they don't want to be the last one waiting for every bit of evidence so that everyone else has the benefit of something while they're still waiting for perfect evidence 10 years later. And so this concept of connecting evidence with essentially how choices are made under uncertainty, to me, it sort of points out that you need much more than just a background in systematic review. You need a background in decision-making and in clinical epidemiology, that is how to design studies to learn from experience to really do our job well. So, adaptations of an evidence shop in a learning health system: understand the questions, diversify the product line accordingly, conduct reviews on learning health system topics, that is, topics that are really about being a learning health system, like scaling beyond early adopters. Emphasize effectiveness research over efficacy research, and use exemplars of implementation when available. Combine with other sources of information. Consider whether a literature is not informative because the underlying theory of practice is wrong. I didn't have time to talk about that. And inform processes that use health system data. So thanks, and if you have further questions, feel free to contact me or our operations director, Nicole Floyd in Portland. Thank you.